At dawn, a county road crew halted beside a snow-choked turnout where wind had erased tire marks. A stiff canvas bag lay half-buried, zipped, anonymous. The cold preserved silence. When deputies unsealed it, paperwork frostbitten and breath visible, dread settled before conclusions, measured, procedural, unavoidable in the early light. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. This case would come to be known in Carbon County as the Winter Discovery, a phrase that carried weight among men who read local papers with morning coffee and remembered where they were in 1999. Wyoming was quiet then, stretched thin by distance, ruled by weather. December pressed early darkness over Rawlins, and Christmas decorations glowed against snowbanks along Cedar Street. The victim was identified within hours as 22-year-old Emily Hartman, a student finishing a teaching certificate, home for the holidays, last seen 3 days earlier after a Thanksgiving weekend that blurred into early winter routines. Emily Hartman fit the age and pattern that law enforcement logs recognize without romanticism. She lived modestly, worked part-time at a feed store, and drove a 10-year-old sedan with a cracked windshield. Her disappearance was not reported immediately because adults sometimes miss a day, then two, then surface. When her mother called the Rawlins Police Department on December 2, the intake form noted weather delays and possible voluntary absence. That notation would later be crossed out. The bag discovered by the road crew sat near an old service spur leading to oilfield leases, a place known to locals but ignored by travelers. Deputies photographed the scene, measured distances, and logged temperatures hovering below 10 degrees. The medical examiner noted early preservation consistent with prolonged cold exposure after death, not before, a distinction that would matter. No outward trauma was described at the scene. The body was transported to Cheyenne for autopsy, under chain of custody seals that would remain intact. Media coverage was restrained, as it often was then. The Rawlins Times ran a single column on page 3, describing a missing woman and requesting information. Flyers were taped to grocery store corkboards and the courthouse vestibule. Men in their 60s would later recall reading those notices between errands, assuming the answer would come quickly. It did not. The autopsy report, finalized December 6, 1999, recorded cause of death as asphyxia due to external obstruction, manner homicide. The language was clinical. There was evidence of restraint, consistent with ligature marks on the wrists and trace fibers collected from clothing. Toxicology was negative for alcohol and common narcotics. Time of death was estimated between November 29 and December 1, narrowed by stomach contents and ambient temperature data. Investigators reconstructed Emily's final days with calendars, receipts, and bank records. She had attended Thanksgiving dinner with relatives in Laramie, returned to Rawlins on November 28, and worked a morning shift on the 29th. Afterward, she stopped at the post office and a gas station on Spruce Street. Surveillance footage from the gas station was grainy, stored on magnetic tape, but confirmed her presence at 2:14 p.m. She did not use her debit card again. Witness interviews followed a standard order. Coworkers described nothing unusual. Neighbors reported seeing her car parked outside her apartment on the night of the 29th, lights off. By the morning of the 30th, the car was gone. It would be found a week later in a long-term lot near the interstate, unlocked, keys missing, interior undisturbed. Snow had fallen twice since it was left there, complicating tire analysis. Evidence collection in 1999 was thorough by the standards of the time, yet limited by technology. Fibers were compared manually. DNA extraction yielded a partial male profile from under Emily's fingernails, insufficient then for CODIS entry. The profile was documented and stored. Hair found on the canvas bag was microscopically consistent with canine, likely incidental. The investigation broadened. Detectives canvassed oilfield workers, seasonal laborers, and truck drivers who passed through during Thanksgiving week. Wyoming's transient workforce complicated timelines. Hundreds of names were logged, alibis checked, most eliminated. One man, a former classmate named Daniel Reeves, was interviewed twice after an anonymous tip referenced a disagreement weeks earlier. His alibi, supported by work logs from a drilling site, held. As December gave way to Christmas, the case cooled. Patrol shifts rotated through holiday coverage. The Hartman family spent Christmas Eve in a quiet house, lights on, gifts unopened. The department assigned the case to a single investigator for continuity. He maintained binders, labeled by date, that would be archived and revisited over years. In 2000 and 2001, periodic reviews produced no arrest. The partial DNA profile was entered into state databases as they expanded, with no hits. Advances in fiber analysis ruled out several early persons of interest. Media attention faded. Emily's name remained on a memorial plaque at the courthouse, added during a victim's remembrance service each November. The turning point would not come for more than 2 decades, and it would arrive through procedure rather than revelation. In 2021, Wyoming joined a regional initiative to re-examine cold cases using modern forensic genealogy where appropriate. Emily Hartman's case met criteria: preserved biological material, unresolved status, lawful authorization. A fresh extraction yielded a full, single-source male DNA profile. Investigators uploaded the profile to CODIS. Within weeks, a hit returned to an offender named Mark Ellison, arrested in Colorado in 2008 for an unrelated assault. At the time of Emily's death, Ellison was 27, employed intermittently on oilfield maintenance crews, and known to travel through Carbon County. His name appeared in the original canvas as a transient worker interviewed once and dismissed due to lack of evidence. A warrant authorized a confirmatory buccal swab. The match was conclusive, with probabilities exceeding accepted thresholds. Detectives reconstructed Ellison's movements in late November 1999 through payroll stubs, motel records, and fuel receipts. He had been in Rawlins on November 29, checked into a budget motel off the interstate, and departed early on the 30th. Additional evidence was sought to ensure a lawful, verifiable case. Fiber analysis was revisited, and a match was found between fibers on the canvas bag and a tarp recovered from Ellison's storage unit, seized under warrant. Cell phone records did not exist from 1999, but toll records placed his vehicle near the service spur the night of November 30. Ellison was arrested without incident in Fort Collins in March 2023. He was extradited to Wyoming, charged with first-degree murder, and held without bond. Pretrial motions addressed evidence admissibility, chain of custody, and statute considerations. The court ruled the evidence sound. The trial concluded with a guilty verdict based on DNA, corroborating circumstantial evidence, and reconstructed timelines. Ellison was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after decades, consistent with state law at the time of offense. The Hartman family attended sentencing quietly. Afterward, Rawlins returned to routine. The binders were closed. Emily Hartman's case was marked solved. Snow fell again that winter, as it always does, covering roads and erasing tracks, while records remained complete and final. For the men who followed the case from a distance, the resolution carried a particular weight shaped by age and memory. Many had raised families in towns like Rawlins, trusted process, and understood time as an investigator that never stopped working. Records mattered. So did patience. The quiet aftermath reflected that ethic. There were no parades, only updated files, a press release, and a brief mention on the local radio station during a weather report. The courthouse kept its routines. Clerks stamped documents. Boxes returned to climate-controlled storage. The service spur where the bag was found remained unmarked, a place passed by without notice. Thanksgiving came again, then Christmas lights along Cedar Street, then New Year's snow. The Hartman family established a scholarship in Emily's name at a community college, modest and practical, aimed at future teachers. Law enforcement conducted an internal review, documenting lessons learned and procedural strengths. The preservation of evidence through decades of moves and budget cycles was cited as critical. Training modules were updated to emphasize long-term stewardship of biological material and thorough, early canvassing, even when immediate leads fail. Mark Ellison's appeals were denied. His name faded into court indexes. He was transferred to a state facility where routine replaced movement. The community's shock settled into acceptance, the kind earned by facts tested and upheld. For those who read the final story with coffee, the ending felt complete, not dramatic, anchored by dates, temperatures, and signatures that closed a chapter without reopening wounds. Emily Hartman's memory persisted in ordinary ways, in scholarship recipients, and an annual line in a victim's report. The case demonstrated how winter can hide truths and how methodical work can reveal them, even years later, without noise or spectacle. It ended as it began, in the cold, with records intact and answers finally placed where they belonged. Resolution arrived slowly, lawfully, and finally, proving that diligence outlasts seasons, budgets, forgetfulness, and the long Wyoming winters always. The case did not close in 1999, and for the next several years it lived inside filing cabinets, computer backups, and the habits of men who refused to discard unfinished work. Wyoming winters came early and left late, and with each December the Hartman file was pulled again, not because of new leads but because time itself demanded review. The investigator assigned in 2000 began each pass the same way, starting with the initial discovery report, reading it aloud in his office, checking measurements, weather notes, and handwriting. He knew that mistakes usually appeared where familiarity dulled attention. Emily Hartman's life before her disappearance was reconstructed repeatedly, not sentimentally but methodically. Her employment records showed consistent attendance. Her school transcripts confirmed plans to complete student teaching in the spring. Phone bills from a landline listed local calls only. There were no indications of flight, debt, or instability. This absence of motive complicated the case, because crimes without clear precursors resist quick explanations. The working theory remained opportunistic violence by someone with local knowledge and temporary presence. Between 2000 and 2005, the Rawlins Police Department logged more than 100 follow-up interviews. These included oilfield supervisors, motel clerks, highway maintenance staff, and seasonal hunters passing through during late November. Each interview followed a standard form, with time stamps, weather recollections, and vehicle descriptions. Most recollections blurred under questioning. Memory degraded quickly after the first year, particularly regarding dates around Thanksgiving, when travel patterns overlapped and routines shifted. Physical evidence was re-examined as laboratory capabilities improved incrementally. The partial DNA profile extracted in 1999 was retested in 2003 with the same result: insufficient markers for a database hit. Analysts documented the limitations carefully, preserving remaining sample material. The canvas bag itself was stored flat in a climate-controlled room, sealed, labeled, and photographed annually to confirm integrity. This routine stewardship would later prove decisive, though no one said so aloud at the time. The car recovery remained a focal point. Investigators mapped the long-term lot near the interstate, measuring sightlines, lighting conditions, and traffic patterns as they existed in 1999. They confirmed that the lot was commonly used by travelers leaving vehicles for several days. Snow removal logs showed plowing on December 1 and December 4, erasing impressions. No usable prints were recovered. The absence of disturbance inside the vehicle suggested compliance, rather than struggle, reinforcing theories of deception or surprise. Media attention resurfaced briefly in 2004 when a regional paper ran a retrospective on unsolved Wyoming cases. The article quoted police statements emphasizing patience and evidence. Tips increased for several weeks, most unrelated. One caller suggested a connection to a truck stop altercation in Utah, which was investigated and dismissed. Another alleged a serial offender operating along the interstate. No corroboration followed. The case returned to quiet. In 2008, when Mark Ellison was arrested in Colorado for assault, his name appeared again in peripheral checks, flagged by a detective cross-referencing transient laborers with later violent charges. Without DNA linkage, no action followed. Ellison's movements in 1999 were still incomplete, and no witness placed him with Emily Hartman. Procedural caution prevailed, preventing speculation from becoming accusation. By the 2010s, the case transitioned formally into cold status. Responsibility shifted to a rotating review committee that met quarterly, composed of senior investigators and a prosecutor. Their mandate was preservation and readiness, ensuring that if technology advanced, the file would be usable. They digitized documents, scanned photographs, and updated indices. Every December, the committee reviewed unsolved cases as part of an annual audit, a practice tied to grant requirements and institutional memory. The Hartman family maintained contact with the department, measured and respectful. They provided updates on their own movements, consented to renewed publicity when requested, and avoided public confrontation. This cooperation mattered. It allowed investigators to test theories without external pressure distorting priorities. In small towns, restraint often carries more weight than noise. The breakthrough came not with drama but with policy. In 2020, Wyoming allocated funds for forensic genealogy partnerships, outlining strict legal thresholds. Emily Hartman's case was nominated and approved. Consent forms were reviewed. Warrants were obtained. Evidence was transported under escort. Analysts worked quietly, aware that expectations should remain modest. When the full DNA profile emerged, it did not announce itself as destiny. It entered databases and waited. The hit to Mark Ellison returned with a statistical confidence that required no embellishment. Investigators verified the match independently, then built a parallel case without relying solely on genetics. This discipline protected the prosecution from future challenge. Ellison's historical footprint was reconstructed through analog records. Motel registries, often overlooked, proved critical. A clerk's handwritten log from November 1999 listed Ellison's name, payment in cash, and a vehicle description matching later records. Payroll stubs showed a gap in employment consistent with travel. Fuel receipts placed him on Interstate 80 during the relevant window. Each piece alone was insufficient. Together, they formed a credible timeline. The storage unit search uncovered the tarp fibers that matched the canvas bag at a level consistent with shared manufacture and wear. Analysts documented transfer probabilities conservatively. The service spur location was linked through toll records and maintenance logs, indicating Ellison's vehicle class had access during the night hours. Investigators avoided narrative leaps, letting documents speak. Arrest procedures followed standard protocol. Ellison was informed of charges. He did not resist. Interviews were recorded. He denied involvement, offering vague recollections of travel. No confession was sought as a condition for closure. The case did not require it. Evidence was enough. Court proceedings unfolded over months. Motions addressed the admissibility of genealogical methods, with the court affirming compliance with constitutional standards. Expert testimony focused on process rather than persuasion. Jurors received timelines, maps, and charts. The absence of sensational elements reinforced credibility. The verdict reflected accumulation, not revelation. Sentencing closed the legal chapter. Life imprisonment aligned with statutory guidelines in effect at the time of offense. Victim impact statements were brief. The judge emphasized records, preservation, and patience. There was no applause. Afterward, the department conducted a debrief, identifying strengths and gaps. Evidence preservation protocols were praised. Early assumptions about transient suspects were reconsidered. Training emphasized that absence of immediate leads does not equate to absence of resolution. The Hartman file was archived with a final notation: solved. For the community, closure arrived quietly. The Rawlins Times ran a follow-up piece acknowledging the outcome. The service spur remained unnamed. Winter returned. Christmas lights reflected off snowbanks. Men who remembered the flyers folded the paper and moved on, trusting that the system, when allowed time and care, could still deliver answers without spectacle. In the years following the verdict, the Emily Hartman case became a reference point inside Wyoming law enforcement for how time reshapes investigations without changing their foundations. The records showed that patience was not passive. It required scheduled reviews, disciplined storage, and a willingness to revisit assumptions without rewriting history. For older observers, especially men who had worked trades or public service, that approach felt familiar. It mirrored maintenance rather than repair, the steady checking of bolts and bearings rather than dramatic intervention. The evidence trail was preserved with unusual care for a department of its size. Climate logs from the storage facility documented temperature and humidity levels month by month. When the county upgraded its records building in 2012, the Hartman materials were transported first, escorted, inventoried twice, and resealed. This attention prevented degradation that might have compromised later testing. Investigators noted that most cold cases fail not from lack of effort, but from loss of integrity over time. Community memory lingered in understated ways. A bench near the courthouse lawn bore a small plaque added quietly by friends. It did not reference the crime, only Emily's name and years. Each Thanksgiving, local churches listed her among those remembered, a single line in a program dominated by seasonal routine. There were no marches, no slogans. The town's response reflected its culture, restrained and inward, valuing continuity over display. The legal aftermath extended beyond sentencing. Appellate briefs reviewed evidentiary standards applied to genealogical DNA. The Wyoming Supreme Court's opinion affirmed lower court rulings, emphasizing that traditional corroboration remained essential. The decision became a citation in later cases, reinforcing boundaries that protected both victims and defendants. This mattered to prosecutors who understood that overreach in one case could weaken many. Mark Ellison's incarceration followed predictable patterns. Intake assessments noted age, health, and prior record. He was classified and assigned accordingly. There were no incidents of note during transfer or early confinement. His appeals focused narrowly on procedural questions, none of which altered the outcome. Over time, his name receded into administrative lists, another inmate defined by numbers and dates rather than notoriety. The Hartman family navigated closure cautiously. They declined interviews beyond a brief statement acknowledging the work of investigators. Their focus shifted to practical memorials. The scholarship fund supported several students annually, modest amounts that covered books or travel, expenses Emily would have recognized. Recipients were informed of the fund's purpose without elaboration. The intent was continuity, not commemoration. For detectives involved, the case reinforced professional habits. Training sessions referenced it when discussing winter scenes, transient populations, and evidence stewardship. Younger officers learned that early conclusions can mislead when conditions obscure timelines. Snowfall, for example, was shown to distort witness confidence. Weather logs became standard attachments to disappearance reports during winter months. The role of local media was also examined. Editors acknowledged that restrained coverage, while reducing pressure, risked diminishing tip flow. Subsequent policies balanced periodic updates with factual tone. The Hartman case illustrated that attention need not be constant to be effective, but silence can close doors. The compromise reflected maturity rather than urgency. Technological change continued. By the mid-2020s, forensic methods advanced further, but the Hartman file required no revision. Its resolution stood on solid ground, insulated from shifting techniques. This stability offered reassurance to communities wary of convictions dependent on novelty. The case showed that modern tools can supplement, not replace, conventional investigation. Seasonal context remained inseparable from memory. Investigators recalled how early darkness altered patrol patterns in 1999, how holiday staffing affected response times. These factors were documented in after-action reviews. Policies were adjusted to ensure coverage during Thanksgiving and Christmas weeks, when travel increases and routines fracture. The lesson was institutional rather than individual. The service spur where Emily was found remained physically unchanged. County maintenance continued as scheduled. No marker identified the spot. Its anonymity aligned with local sensibilities. Residents passed it without comment, aware but unspoken. This quiet respect contrasted with more visible memorials elsewhere, reflecting regional norms shaped by weather and distance. Courthouse archives retained the case under controlled access. Researchers studying cold case resolution requested anonymized data, which the county provided selectively. The Hartman file contributed to broader analyses of case longevity and resolution probability. Findings emphasize that solvability correlates strongly with early evidence preservation, a conclusion consistent with the case's history. As years passed, those who had followed the case aged. Men who were in their 40s in 1999 reached retirement. Their interest in the outcome was less about suspense than about confirmation that systems they trusted still functioned. The resolution affirmed that belief without challenging it. There was satisfaction without triumph. The annual audit of cold cases eventually removed Emily Hartman's name from active lists. The meeting minutes recorded the change tersely. A line was drawn, a file moved. The action symbolized completion rather than forgetting. Records remained accessible, but the work was done. Reflections within the department avoided personalization. The focus stayed on process. Investigators emphasized that no single action solved the case. Instead, accumulation did. Each receipt, log, and sample mattered. This message resonated with those accustomed to incremental progress, reinforcing professional identity. The broader community absorbed the outcome gradually. Conversations occurred in hardware stores and diners, brief and factual. There was little speculation. The facts were accepted as settled. This acceptance marked the true end of the case, when questions ceased and routine resumed. Emily Hartman's story entered local history as a resolved chapter, referenced without embellishment. It served as a reminder that even in sparsely populated regions, accountability can emerge from patience. The case demonstrated that winter's capacity to conceal does not extend indefinitely. Evidence endures when cared for. Each December, as snow returned and lights appeared along familiar streets, the town repeated its rituals. Thanksgiving dinners passed into Christmas mornings. New Year arrived with the same quiet resolve. The Hartman case no longer hovered over these moments. It rested where it belonged, in records complete and conclusions firm, a testament to method over impulse and to time as an ally rather than an enemy. Time altered the meaning of the Hartman case without changing its facts. What had once been a living investigation became an example, cited in training rooms and budget meetings, referenced quietly when administrators argued for storage upgrades or additional forensic contracts. The case demonstrated that long horizons reward restraint. It also showed that communities shaped by distance and weather often understand this instinctively, even if they rarely articulate it. In Rawlins, the rhythm of civic life continued. Snowplows followed predictable routes. The courthouse opened each weekday, flags raised against pale skis. Men who had clipped the original missing person notice from the paper now read about different matters, local taxes or road repairs. Yet when asked years later, many could still recall Emily Hartman's name without prompting. Memory persisted even when attention did not. The investigation files documented how early theories were tested and discarded. One hypothesis focused on a local offender familiar with the service spur. Another emphasized interstate traffic patterns and transient labor. Neither was dismissed outright. Instead, both were held in parallel until evidence narrowed the field. This approach prevented tunnel vision, a risk heightened by limited resources and small-town familiarity. Supervisors noted this balance as a strength rather than an accident. The role of winter conditions received particular scrutiny in retrospective analysis. Snowfall timing affected search windows. Temperature influenced preservation and misled early assumptions about time of death. Darkness altered witness perception. Each factor was logged and later compared against meteorological records. The conclusion was unremarkable but essential. Environment shapes evidence, and investigators must document it with the same care as physical artifacts. Emily Hartman's movements during her final hours were reconstructed repeatedly, each iteration refined by new context. Her routine stops were ordinary, reinforcing the absence of planning or anticipation. This ordinariness underscored the randomness of the crime. There were no warnings embedded in her schedule, no deviations signaling danger. For older audiences, this aspect resonated deeply. It reflected an understanding that stability does not confer immunity. When forensic genealogy entered the case, its use was framed narrowly. Analysts avoided expansive searches, focusing instead on lawful pathways that preserved privacy boundaries. This discipline reassured the court and the public. It also reinforced that technology must operate within existing legal frameworks. The Hartman case thus became a model for integration rather than disruption. The courtroom process itself was methodical. Exhibits were presented sequentially, building a timeline that jurors could follow without inference. Maps showed distances between the gas station, Emily's apartment, the interstate lot, and the service spur. Receipts anchored dates. Laboratory reports explained probabilities without exaggeration. The prosecution avoided emotive language, trusting accumulation. Defense challenges were addressed point by point, reinforcing confidence in outcome. Observers noted the absence of spectacle. There were no dramatic revelations, no surprise witnesses. This absence was deliberate. It reflected an understanding that credibility rests on consistency. For a jury composed largely of local residents, many familiar with winter travel and oilfield work, this grounded approach mattered. After sentencing, the formal closure process unfolded. Evidence was cataloged as adjudicated. Digital files were flagged as resolved. Physical items were retained according to statutory schedules. The department updated its public records index. These steps were procedural, but they carried symbolic weight. They marked the transition from pursuit to preservation. The quiet aftermath extended to the Hartman family's interactions with the town. They resumed routines without public markers of grief. Friends noted their preference for normalcy. This choice aligned with community norms that value endurance over display. The family's approach shaped how the case was remembered, emphasizing resolution rather than tragedy. Educational institutions incorporated the case into criminal justice curricula, anonymized and abstracted. Students examined decision points, evidence handling, and ethical considerations. The discussion focused on process integrity rather than outcome. In this way, Emily Hartman's case contributed to future practice without being reduced to a narrative device. Local law enforcement agencies across Wyoming shared lessons learned. Conferences included sessions on cold case management, citing the Hartman file as an example of sustained stewardship. Agencies with fewer resources adopted similar practices, prioritizing documentation and storage even when active investigation waned. This diffusion of practice extended the case's impact beyond county lines. Seasonal anniversaries continued to shape perception. Each November, internal reviews revisited unresolved cases. Emily Hartman's name no longer appeared on those lists, but her file remained accessible. Investigators described a subtle shift when a case moves from unresolved to resolved. It no longer demands vigilance, but it still commands respect. The service spur's anonymity remained intact. Some argued for a marker, others against. Ultimately, no action was taken. The decision reflected a consensus that remembrance need not be tied to geography. For those who valued quiet closure, the absence of a sign felt appropriate. The legal system's handling of appeals reinforced finality. Written opinions emphasized adherence to standards rather than novelty. This focus reassured stakeholders that the conviction rested on firm ground. It also discouraged speculation that future technological shifts might unsettle the outcome. Over time, the Hartman case faded from conversation, not through suppression but through completion. New cases demanded attention. New winters brought new challenges. Yet when discussions turned to cold cases, the example remained. It illustrated that resolution does not always arrive with momentum. Sometimes it emerges from maintenance, from records kept intact across decades. The town's relationship with law enforcement reflected this understanding. Trust was not exuberant but steady. Residents expected diligence rather than immediacy. The Hartman case validated that expectation. It showed that even when answers are delayed, they are not abandoned. As the years progressed, the men who had followed the case from the beginning aged further. Their interest in crime stories shifted toward reflection rather than suspense. They valued conclusions that affirmed order without drama. The Hartman resolution fit that preference precisely. Emily Hartman's name remained present in institutional memory without being invoked for effect. It appeared in footnotes, in training slides, in grant justifications. Each reference was factual, stripped of sentiment. This treatment honored the seriousness of the loss without exploiting it. Ultimately, the case demonstrated that closure is not an event but a process. It unfolds through documentation, adjudication, and acceptance. It settles into routine where it belongs. For Rawlins, for Wyoming, and for those who observed quietly, the Hartman case ended not with silence but with continuity. Records were complete. Questions were answered. Winter returned as it always does, and life continued within systems proven capable of patience and resolve. The final measure of the Emily Hartman case was not the sentence or the files marked complete, but the way it settled into the community's understanding of itself. Rawlins did not change its routines or rename its streets. The case simply took its place among resolved matters, a reminder that order can be restored without spectacle. Men who had followed the story for years accepted the outcome as they accepted winter storms, with acknowledgement rather than surprise. The facts held. The process held. That was enough. In the months after closure, the department's focus shifted fully to other work. Patrol logs filled with ordinary calls. Detectives returned to active investigations that demanded immediacy. Yet the habits reinforced by the Hartman case persisted. Evidence rooms were checked more often. Documentation grew more meticulous. These changes were incremental, barely visible from outside, but they reflected lessons absorbed rather than announced. The case also shaped how missing person reports were handled during holiday seasons. Policies were updated to reduce delays caused by assumptions about travel or family visits. Intake procedures emphasized early verification without presumption. This adjustment was not framed as reaction to failure, but as refinement. It acknowledged that patterns can mislead when relied upon too heavily, especially during Thanksgiving and Christmas weeks when routines fracture. Emily Hartman's story remained present in the town's collective memory in understated ways. Older residents recalled the weather that year, the early snow, the quiet streets. They remembered reading the paper and expecting resolution that did not come quickly. When it finally did, years later, the delay itself became part of the lesson. Time does not negate responsibility. It only tests commitment. The judicial record closed cleanly. No unresolved motions lingered. No evidentiary questions remained open. This completeness mattered to those who valued finality. The law had spoken within its bounds. The outcome rested on verifiable facts rather than conjecture. For observers wary of changing standards, this steadiness reinforced confidence. In institutional terms, the case entered the archive of resolved homicides, indexed and accessible. Researchers reviewing long-term trends cited it as an example of delayed but successful resolution. Its data contributed to broader understanding without being isolated or dramatized. This integration reflected respect for the seriousness of the matter. The Hartman family's approach to closure influenced the tone that followed. By declining extended public engagement, they set boundaries that the community respected. Their focus on practical memorials aligned with local values. It allowed remembrance without reopening wounds. This restraint shaped how the case was discussed afterward, factual and contained. As years passed, newer residents learned of the case only in passing. It was referenced without embellishment, often in discussions about forensic advances or cold case management. Its presence in conversation was proportional to its significance, neither inflated nor diminished. This balance reflected a mature relationship with the past. Seasonal cycles continued to frame memory. Each winter brought similar conditions, similar challenges. Snow fell on the same roads. Darkness arrived early. These constants underscored the environment in which the crime occurred and the investigation unfolded. They also highlighted the persistence required to work within such constraints. For law enforcement, the case reinforced the value of continuity amid turnover. Investigators retire. Administrators change. Budgets fluctuate. Records endure. The Hartman file demonstrated that preservation bridges these shifts. It allows work begun under one set of conditions to conclude under another without loss of integrity. Mark Ellison's life sentence removed him from the community's horizon. His name appeared only in official contexts, devoid of narrative. This absence of notoriety aligned with the case's tone. Accountability was achieved without elevation. The focus remained on resolution rather than the individual responsible. The service spur where Emily Hartman was found remained unmarked, its anonymity intact. This decision reflected consensus rather than indifference. Memory did not require a sign. It lived in records and in the quiet acknowledgement shared by those who knew. The land itself returned to routine use, indifferent and unchanged. Ultimately, the case illustrated that justice, when pursued methodically, does not demand urgency to be effective. It requires steadiness, documentation, and respect for process. These qualities resonated with an audience accustomed to long projects and delayed outcomes. The resolution affirmed that diligence accumulates value over time. As the story reached its end, it did so without flourish. There were no lingering questions, no unresolved threads. The narrative closed where it belonged, in files complete and conclusions firm. Winter returned again as it always would. The town continued. The system proved itself capable. Emily Hartman's case rested, not forgotten but finished.